is from a week ago, so there are a couple of specific references that are going to be a little bit dated because the situation changes quickly enough. But I saw on Breaking Points there was a debate, short debate between the two hosts, Krystal and Saagar and Enjeti, about whether what was going on in Gaza kind of rose to the level of ethnic cleansing. If you don't watch Breaking Points, Krystal's a leftist. She's been on this show a few times, and it's a friend of mine. Saagar is a conservative. I think, in many ways, a relatively chill one as conservatives go, but is somebody who I think is just much more reluctant to use what like registers to him as overheated language. And part of the reason I want to show this is because I actually think he's making the best possible case that could be made against it, but that's actually part of why I found it so disturbing, because I genuinely think the best possible case registers is pretty weak to me. So in any case, it's in two parts, but let's watch the first one.
This was a first. There was the U.S. actually allowed. They didn't veto it. They just abstained. They allowed the UN Security Council to pass a resolution calling for pauses in the fighting in Gaza. That's different than a ceasefire. But as Barak Ravid points out here, this is the first time the UN Security Council adopts any resolution on the war. And I mean, to me, in terms of what their goals are here, to me, it's not a mystery based on the statements of Israeli officials, based on the one I just told you about from the IDF spokesperson, based on the plans that were leaked strategically from an official Israeli government ministry that said, no, what our ideal situation is we push everybody, displace everyone from the north, then we push everybody out of the south, and we basically force Egypt and other Arab nations to take in this Palestinian population. This is something that members of the Netanyahu coalition have wanted for quite some time and have been openly advocating for really for years. So it shouldn't be any surprise that this is the goal, that the goal is complete ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. And there were reports about how pressure is being put on Egypt to use their considerable debt load to try to pressure them into this. There were also reports that there's pressure being put on the U.S. to take in Palestinian refugees as well. But, to me, it's very clear what the goal is. The only question is whether they'll really be able to accomplish this goal. But I just think it's important to keep in mind where we already are in this conflict, which is for Gaza City was incredibly densely populated. This is where the majority of the population of Gaza lived, and it's gone. I mean, 45% of all homes within all of the Gaza Strip, not just in Gaza City, have already been damaged or destroyed. The millions who have been displaced from their homes, there's nothing for them to go back to in Gaza City. That's already where we are. So, are they degrading Hamas capabilities? I don't know. We haven't really seen much evidence of that.
House, yeah.
But I mean, we haven't seen much evidence of really going directly and targeting the military infrastructure. And then there's also the question that Elon Musk asked and that the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff asked as well, which is how many new Hamas members are you creating with these actions, which is part of, the lesson we should have taken from our actions in responding to 9/11. So for me, it's not really a mystery what their goals are, what their approach is. You can see it in what they're telling, their own population, what they're saying publicly, and the military actions that are unfolding on the ground.
Well, I mean, is that the goal of the Israeli far right? Yeah. Is it the overall goal of the Israeli military? I don't know. Like I said,
well, the Israeli military is just doing what they are told.
Well, the quote you read, I actually think was quite accurate, is that they're going for damage, not accuracy. But that's kind of what I'm saying, is that they're basically willing to pull the trigger on a 15, 20% chance. That's just not something the way most Western military.
Okay, I think that actually cut off a little bit early. If we could go into the original and do the a screen share. I think that Krystal is laying it out pretty starkly here in terms of the evidence that you could infer both from the actions, which is the most important thing. And I should also note that if you look at places where there have actually been prosecutions for this afterwards. The kind of countries where you could be hauled before international tribunals if you lose the war. A lot of that has been inferring from
First,
inferring
there was the U.S. actually allowed.
Yeah, so that's where we started. So we should be like, I think to pick up where the clip left off, we should be like maybe 3 minutes into it here. So yeah, but like then the other thing, and I think that in what we're about to watch, this could become much clearer, is that that Saagar in pushing back is trying to say, okay, well maybe this is the goal of the Israeli far right, where in other words, the far right in Israel maybe wants this to progress to the point of outright ethnic cleansing, but that's not necessarily the goal of the Israeli government per se. And I think in ways that kind of become clearer as the debate goes on, little mini debate, whatever we're calling this, right? The exchange goes on. That's a distinction that's kind of getting more and more tenuous, given the nature of the government that's actually in power in Israel right now. Like, I was talking about this with my brother a couple of days ago, saying like in some ways, obviously relative to the vast differences in overall situation between the two, but like it's a little bit like if not only had Donald Trump been president on 9/11, but like if the version of Trump who is like kind of liberals' worst nightmares when Trump was first elected, like what you could sort of be the most worried that he was, if that's fully what he was, that like that guy was president on 9/11, it's a little bit it's a little bit like that. And so I think that distinction that Saagar is trying to draw here gets a little disturbingly hard to draw given some of the people who are actually in government right now. But yeah, let's pick up where we left off.
That's just not something the way most Western militaries would act. That's a different thing, though, than a targeted, like, we're going to blow as much civilians up as possible. I don't really think that's what they're doing. I think it's more in terms of they just don't care as much about collateral damage. But there's an important difference between those two things.
At what point do we go beyond quote unquote collateral damage when somewhere around 90% of the deaths are civilian? Mm-hmm. At what point does, listen, people can lie about their intent, but the numbers don't lie. 40% of the deaths are children. So at what point do you say, like, this isn't collateral damage? This is part of the goal of the operation as evidenced by what has unfolded thus far.
Well, that's what I'm saying, though, is that they just don't care about that number, and they would care and point to the one fair. I'm not justifying this. I'm only saying that the intent matters, and what it all looks like it eventually is. So I don't know
that the intent does matter at a certain point when you have this level of civilian death and targeting of civilian infrastructure.
The intent matters in terms of whether they're going to, what the goal is and what they're willing to. So let's say that their red line was ethnic cleansing. They're like, this is our full-blown goal. Then that's not what you would do. You would do something different. Now, it can be a secondary goal. It could be one of those things that it would be nice. It would fulfill some political, objective. But that's not the way you would conduct that is what they did in between Azerbaijan and Armenia. That's what an actual full-blown ethnic cleansing was going to look like. They
laid out exactly what the goal was, and they have the phase-by-phase process. First, move people out of the north, then put pressure on the south.
Well, this is a secret plan. We don't know if it's been.
That's exactly what is unfolded thus far.
And then
you put off the table any other solution. So, for example, the U.S., which there's a lot of problems with this idea too. It's like, hey, let's have the Palestinian Authority run the Gaza Strip afterwards. No, that's not going to work for us. Which is no surprise because number one, I think Palestinian Authority probably isn't up to the task. But number two, they don't want unity between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then when you couple what's already unfolding in Gaza with what's being done in the West Bank, with settlers being turned loose and basically running wild, massacring Palestinians there as well, and pushing them off their land too, it's very hard for me not to look at the facts as they're unfolding and say, yeah, this is the goal. This is the plan that is unfolding. This is what they're pushing towards. And the only question is whether anyone's going to stand in their way.
Well, I think you think that because you have look, I think that you're coming at it from a place of zero trust from Israel. I wouldn't say I have zero. Let's call it, I don't know. I have a neutral trust of both Hamas and of Israel. We're not willing to assume the worst of really anyone except for the Hamas terrorists, but specifically not the PA. So ethnic cleansing or genocide is one where you have an explicit aim of wiping out this entire race or pushing them out of the region. Now, Is that existing in a document, which we covered here on the show? Yes, absolutely. Is that the official plan? I don't know. There are all kinds of secret plans inside the Pentagon. There were plans inside the Pentagon to break Iraq into 3 parts. There was actually very seriously considered at one point pushed by Vice President Joe Biden. Does that mean it was the actual plan of the U.S. government? Not really. I actually don't think there is a plan. I think there are disparate elements within the Israeli government, some of whom want ethnic cleansing, some of them who have no problem with collateral damage, some of whom are probably much more Western aligned and are ashamed of the way that the entire operation goes. And this is like what the consensus view is. So that seems to me like it's much more like of a cluster rather than any explicit aim. Now, that doesn't justify what all of the deaths are, but it comes to how are we going to, as the United States, the international community, Israel, all of this, what does this all end up look like? I think it probably ends whenever the international community just rug pulls its support. There will be no, final determination on Hamas. There will just be a high death toll. There will be now a huge squabble over internal security, indefinite, and all of that. And I think it's more, in my opinion, is more terrifying that there isn't a plan, that there isn't a consensus plan. So I don't think that there is a plan.
You're right. I don't trust Israel, but actually in this, I'm taking them at their word. When you have security minister, security cabinet member, and minister Avi Dichter of the Likud party, Netanyahu's party, announcing the plan for residents of Gaza is Gaza Nakba 2023. That's how it'll end. When you have Bezalel Smotrich calling for the, quote, voluntary migration of Gaza Arabs to the countries of the world. When you have Netanyahu himself comparing Palestinians to the biblical foe of the Jewish people, Amalek, who they are called to destroy, including women and children. I'm taking them at their word of what they actually want to do here, and as evidenced by their actions thus far, which are entirely consistent with pushing the population out of Gaza entirely. Now, again, does that mean they will succeed? Not necessarily. It depends on whether the U.S. decides that we are going to, accept this quote unquote final solution, and I do use those words very intentionally, of the population in the Gaza Strip, or whether we are going to step in and use the considerable leverage that we have. But I'm just looking at their actual statements and their actions on the ground.
Yeah, I agree, Krystal, but the person that you read is a freaking agricultural. That's like saying Tom Vilsack's opinion on Israel matters. Like, who is
He's a member of the security cabinet.
Yes, but I mean, technically, Tom Vilsack is a member of the U.S. cabinet.
Well,
so
do you want to take,
I can say
the president of Israel saying there are no innocent civilians?
Yes, that's much more important.
You want to take Netanyahu himself, again, comparing them to Amalek, the historical foe of the Jewish people, and calling for them to be completely wiped out, including women, children, and infants.
So I agree. I think that the president of Israel, who, by the way, is the head of state and actually has no power, but that's a secondary thing. It's still important for the head of state for what the statements and all that.
All right. Keeps going for a little while afterwards, but I mean, that was the main part of it. And this is what I was kind of saying earlier, that the thing that I find maybe most disturbing looking at this is that, if you're sort of somebody who's not just going to sort of like yell and be ridiculous like Eli Lake or somebody, but is going to like try to pay attention to what, Krystal in this case is saying, and, is like been following the news closely about it and et cetera. And they're trying to make the best case that they can that this doesn't rise to the level of ethnic cleansing. It ends up being troublingly weak, that you get all like there's a lot of this weird game of like, okay, well, here are like 5 members of the cabinet who all called for genocide or total removal of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, but they're not like the most important members of the cabinet. And the president, the head of state, said this, that there were no innocent civilians in Gaza, but but the president is really more ceremonial there. Okay, Prime Minister Netanyahu himself did this comparison of he said Hamas was Amalek, and he didn't draw out the thought, but like the disturbing implication of saying Hamas is Amalek. You go back and read the book of Samuel in the Old Testament, is that Israelites are commanded to destroy Amalek, including women, children, and suckling babes. Right? I mean, that's what it says in there. So, maybe if you're really, really committed to this, you can find an innocent interpretation of Hamas's Amalek, but all of the oars do kind of seem to be pointing in the one direction here. And it's very hard not to see it in that light.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about this debate, I think there's kind of two things that come to mind, right? First is that we can't have 100% knowledge of certain things, right? Like in terms of like exactly what Israel's intention is, right? That's not something we can operate like with mathematical certainty, right? So all we can do is make our best fucking guess, right, of what will happen next, right? And then in terms of, so the point is like, debating whether it's a genocide or what it is, sometimes this stuff gets almost into like definitional stuff and word game stuff, which a lot of times is like what, right-wing people or centrist people really like to do, right? We can all agree that what has happened already is an atrocity, or at least those of us, on the left can agree with that. And then the question of Israel's intent, that's more interesting for like, well, what are they going to do in the future, and what should America do to try to stop it, right? So I think that's when that question becomes extremely pertinent, right? Of like what their goal is, and we're not, we don't have the knowledge to know exactly what they're going to do, but we can make a really, really strong guess, right? Like 90%, 95%. So I think what I'm saying is that he's clinging on to these like epistemic doubt of like the 2%, right? Of like, oh, maybe this won't happen, or maybe it's not, right? But like the fact that it seems like the preponderance of the evidence is that this is what they're trying to do is like, is just an absolute nightmare. So I feel like we should just take it extremely seriously. And there's really not that much utility clinging on to that small chance that that's not really what they're trying to do, or it's a secondary goal, unless you're making like a pretty positive, concrete argument that, oh no, that means that they're actually going to take a different course of action. So I feel like a lot, sometimes these debates kind of get flattened in a way that, make it easy to deflect. And I'm not saying that he really doesn't seem like a Zionist, but, we can all remember that most Zionist talking points of propaganda have to do with some, deflection is their number one tool. Always deflecting, right? So to me, like if I'm debating a Zionist, I try to say, okay, but what you're trying to tell me is that this level of civilian deaths, which is like what, like she said, like 90% or something like that.
90%, yeah.
Yeah, is that worth your goal? Because that's what you have to argue. And if you want to argue that, you basically have to argue that if the 90% of civilian deaths were worth it to kill the dozens of Hamas people that they killed, and that was worth it because Hamas is going to wipe out all Jews on planet Earth, right? Which is millions of people.
They definitely have the capacity to do that.
That's the utilitarian calculus that they're basically invoking, right? But like, let's argue that if we're really going to have a conversation. But deflections into like, is it on purpose? Is it ethnic cleansing?
Well, so the question of what's on purpose. And by the way, I should say, I saw in the chat somebody asked about. There was a line that's like, I think maybe a little bit confusing out of context, where Krystal said something about the PA probably not being up to the task anyway. This is just an artifact of us only showing you part of the episode. If you watch the whole thing, there's a line, I think before this section, where she talks about how part of the problem is that the Palestinian Authority is really unpopular because they're seen as compromised because of collaboration with Israel on the West Bank, right? So that's why she was saying they might not be up to the task anyway, but that was really a side point here. But on this specific subject of intent, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I don't want to bring on Samuel and Matt, but I had an article that's up in Jacobin today. And it's called "The Human Shield's Defense of Bombing Gaza Civilians is Morally Bankrupt," and it's basically just making a couple of pretty simple points, because the intention, the claim that's always made about intention is, oh well, see, the goal is just to kill these Hamas guys, and it's this unfortunate side effect that 90% of the people who die are civilians, which of course there's a way of being kind of horrifyingly callous about that, talk about collateral damage and stuff like this. And it's like, I saw, in fact, an Israeli friend sent me last night this Reuters article that, was about this kid in Gaza whose parents had both been killed, and whose legs, the kid's legs, had to be amputated. And like the opening line of the article is like he wants to get up and he wants to see his parents. It's like just incredibly disturbing to read, but like in this this argument about intent, right? There's all this stuff about Hamas using civilians as human shields, and the one, of course, the factual premise here is incredibly suspect after previous wars, if that's what we're going to call these, in 2009 and 2014. Amnesty International did reports where they investigated this, and they slammed Hamas for all kinds of other violations of international humanitarian law. But on the specific claim of human shielding, they said there's really no evidence of Hamas directing the movements of civilians to shield military infrastructure operations. In fact, interestingly enough, by contrast, the IDF actually has very literally done that many times in the past. The Israeli High Court said they weren't allowed to in 2005, but that hasn't entirely stopped it in the years since then. What I mean is stuff like forcing Palestinian civilians to approach homes for them because they'll be less likely to be shot than Israeli soldiers, things like that. But this specific claim is often incredibly sketchy. And if you listen closely, what people are saying is not really literal human shielding, like in a hostage situation or like those Israeli tactics that I was talking about, but just that Hamas military stuff is close to various kinds of Palestinian civilian stuff. And the point I'd make there is just that this is not uncommon. Neither Israel nor the United States, for example, make any great effort to separate our military stuff from civilian stuff. I remember many years ago going to a protest at the military base in Fort Benning, Georgia, and thinking about the fact that there were residential homes lining the street that literally dead ends at the gates of the military base. So if anybody was bombing the United States, you can kind of think about for 10 seconds about how that would play out. Or in fact, right now in Tel Aviv, the building, it's Tel Aviv, it's not Jerusalem, the building in Tel Aviv where Netanyahu meets with his security cabinet during the war is this military base called the Kiryat, which we actually have an overhead graphic of what that looks like. And if you're saying, oh, where's the base and all that? Well, that's kind of the point, right? It's kind of buried in all of that, right? There are apartment complexes, office buildings, 2 different shopping malls, at which I'm told that you can, like, any given hour of the day, you can see lots of uniformed Israeli soldiers from the military base eating at the food court, during breaks and stuff. So, this is, again, I don't think, either Israel or the United States puts a lot of effort into this separation of military infrastructure from civilians. And certainly, and in Israel's case, and for sure in the United States case, we have far greater potential to do so, right? Because, bigger, I mean, even Israel, it's a very small country, but I mean, it's obviously a hell of a lot bigger than the Gaza Strip. And certainly the United States is a vast and sprawling nation. Whereas the Gaza Strip is 3 times as densely populated as Los Angeles, and the whole place is all of 25 miles long and 6 miles wide. So, it seems like this kind of human shield thing makes the least sense there. But also, more importantly, forget all that for a second. Let's just pretend, for the sake of argument, that the accusation is 100% correct, that Hamas was doing something that is literally equivalent to like that hostage situation sense of human shielding. There's something very, very strange about the inference here, because that's not normally, like, we don't normally think that if somebody's being used as a human shield, therefore their life is forfeit. And
I mean, unless you're Keanu Reeves from Speed.
Okay. Even there, though, right? I mean, they're trying to get everybody off the bus.
Yes.
That's
and he worked really hard to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Like that, you normally think, like, there is a reason why in Hollywood movies and TV shows this is always portrayed as this agonizing dilemma, right? Because precisely because we would not be expected to cheer for a protagonist who just wildly sprayed gunfire at not only the villain but also the random civilians that the villain was trying to use. If somebody, if a active shooter ran into a daycare center and picked up 2 children, and you shot one of them in the course of shooting him, right? There would be hearings about that. There would people fired over that. As well there should have been, right? So we're talking in this case about thousands upon thousands of children being killed. I think the human shield defense is sort of incoherent on its own terms. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.